Excuse me, do you girls know Daniel?
You're Mr. Cornish. You're Daniel's dad.
The groundskeeper at Sycamore Hill used to joke that he could set his watch by Harry Cornish. Every Sunday, rain or frost or blistering heat, the old man came through the east gate at exactly 8:15, wearing the same gray flat cap, carrying nothing but his own silence. Harry had heard the joke secondhand once years ago and hadn't found it funny. A man doesn't choose to become predictable. Grief does that to him. 5 years. 52 Sundays a year, minus the one he'd missed for pneumonia and the one he'd missed for a hospital bed of his own. Harry could have told you the number without doing the math. He'd done the math too many times not to know it by heart. He owned 4 companies and a name that opened doors in 3 states, and none of it had bought him a single morning where he woke up and didn't reach out of habit for a son who wasn't there to call. People who read about Harry Cornish in the business pages pictured a man untouched by anything, the kind of wealth that insulates. They had never seen him standing in front of a headstone with granite dust still catching afternoon light, trying to remember what his son's actual laugh had sounded like instead of the version memory kept smoothing over. Daniel had been 32. A curve in the road, rain that hadn't let up all week, a guardrail that gave out where it shouldn't have. The county called it weather. Harry had never once let himself wonder if it might have been something else, because the alternative was a door he didn't know how to walk through. Margaret would have known what to do with a Sunday like this one. Harry's wife had been gone 11 years by then, taken slow by an illness that gave them time to say everything and somehow still left things unsaid, and in the quiet arithmetic Harry never spoke aloud, he'd counted it a small mercy that she hadn't lived to bury their son too. Grief, he'd come to understand, didn't get lighter with practice. It only got quieter, a storm that turned into a hum you learned to live inside, until something startled it loud again. He'd built Cornish Holdings from a single warehouse lease into 4 companies spanning shipping, real estate, and a stake in 2 regional banks, and he'd done all of it, if he was honest with himself, half to prove something to a father who never lived to see it and half to give Daniel something worth inheriting. Daniel had wanted none of it, not really. He'd taken a junior role in the family business more out of duty than ambition, and Harry had spent years quietly disappointed that his son's heart never seemed to be in the numbers the way Harry's had been. It was one more thing they'd never managed to say to each other honestly before it was too late to try. That Sunday, the path curved past the old chapel the way it always did, and Harry rounded the bend expecting the empty stretch of grass he'd expected for 5 years running. He didn't get it. 2 small figures were crouched at Daniel's grave, close together, heads bent like they were sharing a secret with the stone itself. Harry's steps slowed without his permission. He drew closer along the tree line rather than the open path. Some old instinct, the same one that used to tell him not to walk into a negotiation until he understood the room. Under the spread branches of a maple gone rust-colored with the season, he stopped and watched. The girls were young, 8, maybe 9, dressed alike in dresses patterned with small flowers, out of place against the gray stone and the flattened brown grass. Twins, unmistakably, down to the way they held their shoulders. One of them was arranging a handful of white flowers at the base of the headstone with the careful precision of someone who had done this before. The other had her palm flat against the carved letters of Daniel's name, not tracing them, just resting there, the way you might check for a pulse. Harry had never laid eyes on either of them. He held still and listened, and the wind was kind enough to carry their voices to him. "We told him we'd keep coming," the one with the flowers murmured. "Even after we grew up." Her sister didn't look away from the headstone. "He said he'd always be watching out for us. Even from here." The words landed somewhere under Harry's ribs and stayed there, cold and unmoving. Watching out for us. Daniel had no children. Harry would have known, would have been there in the delivery room himself if he'd had to fight his way in. No godchildren Harry had ever been told about. No young cousins close enough in age. And yet these 2 girls knelt at his son's grave with the ease of people returning to a place that belonged to them. Harry stepped out from beneath the maple. Gravel shifted under his shoes, and both girls turned at once, quick and alert but not afraid, which struck Harry even in that moment as strange. Strangers don't usually turn around calm. The one who'd been arranging the flowers rose to her feet first and looked at him the way you might look at someone you'd only ever seen in a photograph, checking the face against the memory of it. "You're Mr. Cornish?" she said. Not a guess. A fact, already confirmed somewhere in her mind before she'd said it aloud. Harry felt the ground tilt slightly under him. "That's right. I don't believe we've." "You're Daniel's dad," the second girl said, quieter than her sister, but just as certain. In 30-some years of boardrooms, hostile buyouts, and one particularly brutal shareholder revolt, Harry Cornish had never once lost his footing in front of another person. He came close to it now. He lowered himself down to the cold grass, joints protesting, until he was eye level with two children who somehow knew exactly who he was. "How did you know my son?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. The girls looked at each other first, a full, wordless conversation passing between them in under a second, the kind only twins seem able to have. "Because he asked us to promise him something," the first girl said finally. "Before he died." Harry's mouth opened around the obvious question. Promise what? But he never got the chance to ask it. "Diane? Donna?" A woman's voice broke across the quiet cemetery, high and urgent. Harry turned to see her coming fast along the path, coat flapping open, eyes locking first on the twins and then, a half-second later, on him, and going wide with something that looked less like surprise and more like dread finally arriving on schedule. She slowed to a stop a few feet away, one hand rising to press against her mouth. "Mr. Cornish?" she said, barely above a whisper, like saying his name out loud might make whatever she'd been dreading more real. Harry looked from the woman to the two girls and back again, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, that whatever he thought he knew about his son's last years was about to come apart in his hands. "What," Harry said slowly, "did my son have to do with your daughters? If you've ever discovered that someone you loved was a completely different person than you believed, keep going." Harry didn't just lose a son that morning. He started finding one. "Read on." Sarah Barry did not answer right away. She stood with a hand on each twin's shoulder, and Harry could see her deciding, in real time, how much of the truth she was willing to hand over to a stranger who happened to be the father of the man who had apparently changed her daughters' lives. "Can we sit?" she asked instead. "There's a bench by the chapel." They walked together in silence, an unlikely procession. A millionaire in a wool coat, a tired-looking woman, and two 8-year-old girls holding hands between them. When they finally sat, Sarah kept her eyes on the twins rather than on Harry, as if drawing courage from them. "5 years ago," she began, "my girls got sick. Both of them at the same time, some kind of respiratory infection that turned into pneumonia. I was working 2 jobs and I still couldn't cover the hospital bills. I was about to lose everything. Our apartment. Custody maybe if things got bad enough." Her voice caught. "And then your son found us." Harry's jaw tightened. "Found you how?" "I don't fully know," Sarah admitted. "He never explained it. He just showed up one day at the hospital and paid what I owed. Then he kept paying rent, school fees, groceries some weeks. He set it up so I never had to ask him directly. And he told me one thing very clearly." She finally looked at Harry. "He said, 'Don't tell my father.'" Sarah told it in pieces, the way people do when a memory still hurts to hold all at once. She'd been sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, out of options, filling out a payment plan she knew she'd never keep up with, when a man in an expensive coat sat down 2 chairs away and asked, without any preamble, what was wrong. She'd almost told him to mind his own business. Something about the way he asked, plainly like he actually wanted the answer, made her tell him instead. "He didn't look like someone who belonged in that hallway," Sarah said. "Too clean. Too calm. I thought he was lost, or maybe some kind of administrator come to tell me my girls were being discharged before they were ready. I never imagined he'd just stay. He sat with me until the sun came up." Harry felt that sentence land like a physical blow. For 5 years he had believed his son threw money at strangers out of some restless guilt, some need to prove himself different from Harry. Reckless, Harry had called it, more than once, in arguments neither of them ever really won. He had never imagined that what looked like recklessness might have been the most disciplined kindness he'd ever failed to notice. "He said you were a good father," Diane said suddenly, looking up at him. "He just said you didn't understand him." Harry had to look away for a moment. He thought of the years he'd spent believing Daniel simply didn't confide in him. The terse phone calls, the vacations Daniel canceled at the last minute, the weekends he'd claimed were work when Harry now understood they'd probably been spent in a cramped apartment 2 towns over, helping 2 little girls with homework their mother was too exhausted to help with herself. He had built an entire narrative out of his son's silences, and every version of that narrative had made Daniel smaller. Not once had Harry considered that the silence might have been protecting someone. Why, he finally managed. Would he hide something like this from me? I would have helped. I would have been proud of him. Diane, unprompted, reached over and put her small hand on top of his, the way you'd comfort someone much older than yourself without quite knowing why you were doing it. Harry looked down at her hand, then up at Sarah, and understood that whatever these two girls had lost when Daniel died, it had been real enough that an 8-year-old still felt the need to comfort a grown man over it 5 years later. Sarah hesitated, and this time the hesitation had weight to it, the kind that comes before something harder than the truth already told. Because he was afraid, she said quietly. He told me a few months before he died that he thought someone was watching him. He never said who. He just got careful. Careful about money, careful about what he wrote down, careful about who knew what. Harry's pulse picked up. Watching him, why? Sarah shook her head. I don't know the details. He didn't want me to know the details. He said it was safer that way. I wanted to come to you after the funeral, Sarah admitted, guilt evident in her voice. I stood outside the church that day for almost 20 minutes working up the nerve. But Daniel had been so insistent, and I didn't know if telling you would undo whatever he'd been trying to protect. So I kept coming here instead every year the way he asked us to. I told myself that was enough. I'm not sure anymore that it was. She paused. But 3 days before the accident he came to see me. He told me, if anything happens to me, protect the girls. And don't give my father what I left behind until the right time. Harry went very still. What did he leave behind? Sarah's eyes met his, steady now. An envelope, she said. It took Sarah 2 days to bring herself to hand it over. She met Harry at a quiet coffee shop across town, the envelope inside a plastic folder like something she'd been protecting from rain for half a decade. The moment Harry saw the handwriting on the front, his own name in Daniel's slanted, hurried script, his hands began to shake. Around them, the coffee shop went on being ordinary, a barista calling out names, a couple arguing quietly about paint colors, the hiss of the espresso machine, and Harry found the ordinariness of it almost unbearable, as if the world owed him the decency of pausing while it handed him this. He hadn't held a letter from his son in longer than he wanted to admit. The last actual correspondence between them had been a curt text about a missed dinner, sent the week before Daniel died, that Harry still hadn't been able to bring himself to delete from his phone. He set the folder down on the table between them and made himself breathe before opening it, aware of Sarah watching him with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and dread, as if she already knew how much of this would hurt. Inside were 4 things. A photograph of Daniel crouched between 2 younger versions of Diane and Donna, all 3 of them laughing, a folded letter, a newspaper clipping about the accident, and a torn scrap of paper with a string of numbers that meant nothing to Harry yet. The letter was longer than Harry expected. Daniel wrote about the girls first, how they become something like family to him, how their laughter had gotten him through a stretch of the worst months of his life without Harry ever knowing those months had been hard at all. Then the letter turned. Dad, I found something in the company books I wasn't supposed to find. Money moving through shell accounts that shouldn't exist. I think someone close to you is stealing, and I think if I bring it to you directly, whoever it is will know I know, and it'll put you in danger before I can prove anything. I'm being careful. I'm documenting everything. I just need more time. The letter went on. I've been keeping records of everything, dates, transfers, who signed off on what. I know how paranoid this sounds. I used to think Victor walked on water same as you did. I don't anymore. Please, whatever happens, don't confront him yourself. Let someone else carry this once I've built the case. I just need a little more time to make it airtight. Harry read the paragraph 3 times before it fully landed. Every argument he'd ever had with Daniel, you're distracted, you're distant, you're throwing yourself into things I don't understand, rearranged itself in his memory into something else entirely. Every time Daniel had said, Dad, just trust me, and Harry had heard defiance instead of a son trying to shield him. Then Harry picked up the newspaper clipping, and something in the corner of the accident photo made him stop breathing. A dark SUV, half in frame, parked on the shoulder near the wreck. Small, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, and Harry, staring at the chrome trim and the particular slant of the side mirror, recognized it immediately. It belonged to Victor Hale. Harry had seen that SUV 100 times, parked in the reserved spot beside his own at the Cornish Holdings building downtown, custom-ordered the year Victor made partner. He'd ridden in it himself more than once on trips to inspect new properties. The idea that it might have been parked near the place his son died on the night his son died was the kind of detail that could be explained a dozen innocent ways, and Harry spent the next several minutes trying to find one and failing every time. Victor, who had built half of Harry's empire alongside him. Victor, who'd stood beside Harry at Daniel's funeral with his hand on Harry's shoulder the entire service. Harry thought of every gala, every fundraiser, every quiet dinner where Victor had sat at his right hand, offering counsel Harry had taken as gospel for 3 decades. He thought about how easy it would have been for a man that trusted to move unnoticed through every account Harry owned. And he thought, with a coldness that surprised him, that if this were true, he would need proof strong enough to survive Victor's lawyers, his reputation, and 30 years of friendship that had apparently been worth exactly nothing. Harry's mouth went dry. Did Daniel ever say why Victor might have been following him? Sarah's eyes widened. You know Victor? He's my closest business partner, Harry said. Has been for 30 years. Sarah reached across the table and turned the newspaper clipping face down, as if she couldn't stand to look at it any longer either. I've had that same picture in a drawer for 5 years, she said quietly. I used to think I was imagining things every time I looked at it. Now I wonder how many other people saw that car and just didn't know what they were looking at. Daniel told me that was the man he was afraid of, Sarah added, her voice dropping almost to nothing. Harry told himself on the drive home that there had to be an innocent explanation. Victor Hale had cried at Daniel's funeral. Victor had personally selected the casket when Harry couldn't bring himself to choose one. Men who did that didn't do the other thing. But Harry had built 3 companies by trusting numbers over feelings, and that night, alone in his study, he pulled the financial records anyway. The study was the one room in the house Harry hadn't changed since Daniel died. The same leather chairs, the same shelf of photographs, Daniel at 8 in a Little League uniform, Daniel at 22 in a cap and gown he'd worn like it itched. Harry worked at the desk beneath that shelf for hours, spreadsheets multiplying across 2 monitors, coffee going cold beside him, and every so often he'd glance up at the photographs as if Daniel might be able to tell him he was wrong. It took him until 2 a.m. to find the pattern Daniel must have found years earlier. Small, irregular transfers routed through consulting firms Harry had never heard of, all of them touching accounts Victor had sole authorization over. The transfers had started roughly 6 months before Daniel died. Millions moved a little at a time, quiet enough to survive every audit Harry's own accountants had run. Harry sat back in his chair, the study cold around him, and understood that his son had found this exact pattern years earlier, alone, 28 years old and with far less institutional power than Harry had said absolutely nothing to him about it, not to protect himself, but to protect Harry. The next morning, Harry drove to Victor's office and asked, as casually as 30 years of friendship allowed, whether Victor remembered Daniel ever raising concerns about the books. Victor's office hadn't changed either. The same view of the harbor, the same framed photo of the 2 of them shaking hands at the ribbon cutting for their first joint acquisition 22 years ago, both of them younger and certain of each other in a way that now felt almost cruel to remember. Victor's face didn't change. That, more than anything, unsettled Harry. Daniel was going through something near the end, Victor said gently, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been questioned in that room. Paranoid, honestly. I hate to say it about your boy, Harry, but he'd convinced himself of things that weren't there. I chalked it up to stress. We all did back then. I didn't think it was worth burdening you with, not with everything else you were carrying. Harry almost believed him. Victor had always been convincing. It was half of what made him good at his job, the same steady warmth that had closed 100 deals and calmed 100 nervous shareholders. It was the thing Harry had trusted most about him for 30 years, and it was, he realized now, exactly the tool a person would need to lie to someone's face for that long. Then Victor added offhandedly as he walked Harry to the door, "How are the little Barry girls doing, by the way? Must be a comfort to you, having a piece of Daniel still around." Harry froze on the threshold. He had never once mentioned Diane and Donna to Victor. No one outside Sarah's small circle even knew their names, let alone their connection to Daniel. Harry himself had only learned it the day before. He managed something non-committal, shook Victor's hand the way he had 1,000 times before, and walked to his car with his pulse hammering the entire way. Harry drove straight home and called Sarah, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. "Keep the girls away from the cemetery for a while. Please." There was a long pause on the line. "It's too late," Sarah said. "What do you mean?" "Someone came to our house last night," she said. asking for the girls. Harry moved Sarah and the twins into a rental house on the far side of the county by that evening, paid in cash under a name that wasn't his own. It was the first time in 5 years he'd felt genuinely useful to anyone. The house was small and plain, nothing like the home Harry had built for himself. A kitchen with mismatched chairs, a living room that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking, and yet Harry found something almost peaceful in it. There was no shelf of photographs here to remind him of what he'd lost. There was just the immediate, uncomplicated work of keeping 3 people safe, and for the first time since the cemetery, his hands had stopped shaking. Once they were settled, he sat with Diane and Donna at the kitchen table and asked them, gently, if Daniel had ever given them anything to keep safe. Donna, the quieter of the two, looked at her sister and then reached into the collar of her dress, pulling out a small brass key on a shoelace. "He told us to keep it hidden," she said. "He said one day his father would come looking for the truth, and when he did, we should give him this." Diane added, "He also said if anyone asked about him, we shouldn't tell them anything. Not even nice-seeming people." Harry turned the key over in his fingers, feeling its weight small and cool against his palm. It seemed impossible that something this ordinary could be the thing his son had trusted 2 children to guard for 5 years. Stamped into the metal was a small logo he recognized instantly, a storage facility 20 minutes from Daniel's old apartment, one Harry had passed 100 times without ever knowing his son had a unit there. The unit was rented under a name that wasn't Daniel's either, D. Reyes, which told Harry everything about how afraid his son had actually been. Harry stood in front of the roll-up door for a long moment before he could make himself lift it, some part of him certain that whatever was behind it would finally make Daniel's death unbearably real in a way 5 years of grieving hadn't managed to. Inside, stacked with the kind of order that only comes from someone documenting evidence for a future they weren't sure they'd survive to see, Harry found folders of financial records, printed emails, photographs, a leather notebook filled with Daniel's handwriting, and a flash drive labeled simply, Dad. He carried everything back to the rental house in 2 cardboard boxes, his arms aching by the time he set them down on the kitchen table, and it wasn't the weight of the boxes that had worn him out. It was the growing certainty, box by box, that his son had spent the final months of his life essentially alone, building a case no one else knew he was building, with no one to tell him he was doing the right thing. Harry plugged the flash drive into his laptop that night with Sarah standing behind him, the twins already asleep down the hall. Daniel's face filled the screen, thinner than Harry remembered, tired in a way Harry had chalked up at the time to overwork. Harry realized watching that he'd noticed the weight loss back then and said nothing about it, too caught up in his own frustration over a missed dinner to ask his son if he was all right. "Dad," Daniel said, "if you're watching this, something happened to me." Harry's vision blurred. "I need you to understand one thing," Daniel continued, his voice steady even as his hands, visible at the edge of the frame, were not. "My death wasn't an accident." The recording cut to black, and Harry sat in the dark kitchen for a long moment before he could bring himself to press play on the next file. The rest of the flash drive told the story in pieces, and Harry made himself watch every one of them. Daniel had found the shell company pattern 8 months before he died. Rather than confront Victor directly, he'd started quietly gathering proof, bank statements, email trails, a recorded phone call in which Victor's voice, unmistakable, instructed someone to keep it under the review threshold. Daniel had been building a case the way a prosecutor would, patient and airtight, because he understood that accusing a man like Victor without proof would only get someone hurt. One recording, dated 3 weeks before the crash, showed Daniel driving at night, talking to the camera propped on his dashboard. "I think he knows I'm on to him," Daniel said. "There was a car outside my building again tonight. Same one as last week. Pause. If something happens to me, Dad, I need you to know I wasn't hiding from you. I was trying to keep you out of it until I had enough to bury him completely." The final entry was the hardest. Recorded the afternoon of the accident, Daniel explained he was driving to meet a source who claimed to have the last piece of evidence he needed, records that would prove not just the theft, but who else was involved. "If I don't make it home," Daniel said quietly, "Sarah has the girls. Dad, I love you." I know it never sounded like it. It always sounded like something else. The recording ended there. Harry sat in the dark of his study for a long time afterward, Sarah having quietly excused herself and said out loud to no one, "My son spent his last days trying to save me. and I spent 5 years thinking he'd walked away from me instead. The last file on the drive was a single photograph, time-stamped the night of the crash. It showed Daniel meeting someone in a parking garage, Victor unmistakably. But Victor wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, half in shadow, was a face Harry recognized instantly. A face that had sat across from him at his own dinner table more times than he could count. The man in the shadows was Elliot Marsh, Harry's personal attorney of nearly 20 years, the man who drafted Harry's will, handled every acquisition, and knew more about Harry's finances than Harry did himself. The conspiracy, Harry now understood, hadn't been Victor acting alone. It had been two men Harry trusted completely, working in tandem, moving money through a scheme sophisticated enough that it had taken Daniel 8 months of careful digging to fully map. And Daniel had found all of it before either of them realized he was looking. Meanwhile, in the rented house across the county, Donna remembered something else. A detail she hadn't thought to mention before because it hadn't seemed important until now. Daniel had once told her, half joking, that he kept a copy of a copy somewhere safe. Somewhere Harry would eventually go looking without needing to be told where. He said it was somewhere his father would go every Sunday, Donna told Harry, sitting cross-legged on the rental home's worn carpet. Harry felt the answer arrive before he'd finished asking the question. The cemetery. Before that thought could fully settle, Harry made himself sit with the twins a while longer, not for evidence this time, but because some instinct told him this mattered just as much. He asked them what Daniel had actually been like, away from all of this. Diane lit up, describing how Daniel used to help with her homework over the phone, badly because he was worse at long division than she was. Donna talked about how he'd shown up for both their birthdays every year with presents that were always slightly wrong in an endearing way, the wrong-colored backpack, a board game they were too old for, because he tried so hard and never quite got it right, and they'd loved him for trying anyway. He always told us, Diane said, never let anyone make you feel like your life doesn't matter. Harry realized, sitting on that carpet, that his son's greatest legacy hadn't been in any boardroom Harry had ever built for him to inherit. It had been sitting in this room the whole time, in two girls who'd known Daniel more completely in some ways than Harry ever had. They went to the cemetery together, Harry, Sarah, Diane, and Donna, on a gray Tuesday afternoon that felt nothing like their usual Sundays. Harry had noticed, on his hundreds of visits, a stone memorial bench a few feet from Daniel's grave, donated by a Cornish family foundation years earlier. He'd sat on it more times than he could count without once wondering if it was hollow. It was. Beneath a loose panel at its base, sealed in a waterproof case, Harry found the last of what his son had left behind. Original financial documents Daniel had physically removed before anyone could destroy them, a recording of Victor threatening him directly in a stairwell, and, the piece that made Harry's stomach drop entirely, a mechanic's inspection photograph showing that the brake line in Daniel's car hadn't failed. It had been cut. The accident had never been an accident. Harry did not go to Victor's house that night, though every instinct told him to. Instead, he drove to the district attorney's office with Daniel's entire archive in a single case, and by the following week, a plan had been built around him rather than by him. Investigators, a controlled meeting, a wire. 2 weeks later, Victor arrived at Harry's house believing the evidence had been quietly buried along with Daniel's memory. Harry let him believe it, right up until he asked evenly, "Why did you kill my son?" Victor's practiced calm finally broke. "Because he wouldn't stop," he said, quiet and almost tired, as if 5 years of guilt had worn a groove into the words. The front door opened before he finished the sentence. It wasn't Harry's staff. Victor and Elliot Marsh were both arrested within the hour, the evidence Daniel had spent the last months of his life gathering finally doing the job he'd built it to do. In the weeks that followed, Harry learned the full shape of what his son had sacrificed. Daniel could have walked away the moment he found the first irregular transfer. Instead, he'd stayed quietly for 8 dangerous months, because he understood that walking away would have left his father exposed and thousands of employees at risk of a company collapsing under theft no one else had caught. Harry returned to the cemetery again as he always did, except this time he wasn't alone and hadn't been for weeks. Diane and Donna laid fresh flowers at the grave while Sarah stood beside Harry, close enough now that the distance between stranger and something like family had quietly closed. Harry knelt beside the two girls who had, without meaning to, given him his son back in pieces he never knew were missing. "Your lives were the last thing my son protected," he told them. "I'll protect them now." The twins hugged him at the same time, one on each side, and Harry, a man who had built an empire on control and precision, let himself simply hold on. As they knelt there, something caught his eye tucked beneath the flowers already resting against the headstone, small, pale against the green, easy to miss unless you were looking. An envelope, his name written across the front in handwriting he would know anywhere. Sarah went still beside him. She recognized it too, some instinct telling her it had been there since before any of this began, waiting for the day someone finally came looking with the right questions. Harry's hands weren't steady as he opened it. Inside was a single page shorter than the letter that had started everything. Dad, if you're reading this, it means you found your way here. It means you know everything now, Victor, Elliot, all of it. I'm sorry you had to learn it this way. I always meant to tell you myself someday when it was safe. But I don't want the last thing you know about me to be a case file. So here's the rest of it, the part that was never about proving anything. I loved my life. Not the version you built for me, the real one, the one with Sarah's kitchen table and the girls' terrible drawings taped to my fridge and Sunday mornings that had nothing to do with either of our companies. I found something there I never found in a boardroom, and I don't regret a single hour I spent protecting it, even the hour it cost me. You spent your whole life building something to hand down. I think I finally understand now that you already had. You just handed it down before either of us realized what it was. Patience. Stubbornness. The refusal to look away from a hard thing. I got all of it from you whether either of us ever said so. Take care of them, Dad. Let them take care of you too. That's the only inheritance I've got left to give, and it's the one I'm proudest of. I love you. I always did. I just never found the right Sunday to say it. Daniel. Harry folded the letter along its worn crease and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart, the way a man holds something he intends to keep there for good. He didn't try to explain it to the girls. Some things weren't for explaining, only for carrying. He had carried 5 wrong years about who his son had been. He would carry the right ones now for however many Sundays he had left. In the months that followed, Harry founded a scholarship and medical assistance fund in Daniel's name, quietly, the same way Daniel would have done it, funding surgeries for children whose parents couldn't afford them, tuition for kids no one else was watching out for. He rebuilt his life with Diane and Donna one ordinary dinner at a time, until his enormous, echoing house started to sound, for the first time in 5 years, like somewhere people actually lived. He still walked through the east gate at Sycamore Hill every Sunday, rain or frost or blistering heat. He wasn't predictable out of grief anymore, though. He came now because Diane liked choosing the flowers herself, and Donna liked correcting his terrible long division on the walk back, and Sarah always had something warm waiting when they got home. Daniel's grave no longer felt like a place Harry visited to remember what he'd lost. It felt at last like the place where he'd found out who his son had truly been, and discovered that the boy he thought had drifted away from him had, in fact, been the truest thing he ever built. Harry Cornish had spent a lifetime believing that legacy meant something you left behind in ledgers and boardrooms. His son had shown him, in the end, that it meant something you leave behind in people. And for the first time in 5 years, that was enough.